Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, winter, 1881. When rancher Ethan Cole found a 16-year-old girl collapsed in a snowstorm, barely breathing and burning with fever, he never asked her name before carrying her home. For 3 weeks, he sat vigil while she fought death, wondering if she'd wake at all. The day she finally opened her eyes, he placed his hat on her head to shield her from the sun, a simple gesture that would bind them across years and distance. What began as mercy would become something neither expected, a love that waited through silence, growth, and a long journey back to where it started. Chapter 1. The Vigil. The blizzard came without warning on December 18th, 1881, turning the Wyoming Territory into a white hell where sky and earth became indistinguishable. Ethan Cole had been checking fence lines when the wind shifted, bringing with it the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes. He turned his horse toward home, squinting against ice needles that stung his face like 1,000 tiny blades. That's when he saw her, a dark shape crumpled against a snow-covered boulder, barely visible except for one outstretched hand that clawed weakly at the frozen ground. Ethan dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots sinking deep into fresh powder. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, her lips blue and face ghostly pale beneath layers of frost. Her dress was torn and inadequate for the brutal Wyoming winter, offering no protection against nature's cruelty. She didn't wake when he lifted her. Her body felt impossibly light, as if the cold had already begun claiming her substance. Ethan wrapped her in his own coat and secured her against his chest, feeling the shallow flutter of breath against his collarbone, the only proof she still lived. The ride back to his ranch took 40 minutes that felt like hours, every gust of wind threatening to steal what little warmth remained in her fragile frame. His cabin sat nestled in a small valley, protected by pine trees that creaked under the weight of accumulating snow. Ethan kicked the door open and carried the girl straight to his bed, the only proper bed in the small ranch house. He stripped away her frozen clothes with clinical efficiency, wrapping her in every blanket and quilt he owned before stoking the fire until flames roared with urgent heat. The fever announced itself within the hour. Her skin burned despite the ice that had nearly claimed her, and she began to shake with violent tremors that rattled the bed frame. Ethan had seen plenty of men die from exposure and fever during his years working cattle drives. He knew the signs, understood the odds, but something in him refused to accept her death as inevitable. He boiled water and crushed willow bark, forcing the bitter tea between her clenched teeth. When she thrashed and cried out in delirium, he held her down with gentle firmness, speaking low words he wasn't sure she could hear. The first night stretched endlessly and terribly, filled with her fevered mumbling about someone named Mama in a place called Cheyenne. Ethan wiped her burning forehead with cool cloths, changed sweat-soaked sheets, and never left her side except to fetch more water or wood for the fire. By the third day, when the fever showed no signs of breaking, Ethan began preparing himself for the worst. He didn't know her name, had no idea where she'd come from or why she'd been wandering alone in a blizzard. But he found himself praying, something he hadn't done since his own mother died 10 years prior. Bargaining with a god he wasn't sure listened to rough men who lived alone on the frontier. The fever broke on the morning of the 4th day. Ethan woke with his head on the edge of the mattress, his hands still wrapped around hers, and realized her skin had cooled. Her breathing had steadied into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep rather than fevered unconsciousness. Relief hit him so hard his hands trembled as he checked her pulse, counting the steady beats and allowing himself to believe she might actually survive. Chapter 2. The Hat and the Goodbye. She slept for 2 more days after the fever broke, a natural, healing sleep that required nothing from Ethan except patience. He used the time to wash her torn dress, mending it with clumsy stitches that would never pass for proper seamstress work. He found a small silver locket tangled in her hair, engraved with initials he couldn't make out, and placed it carefully on the table beside the bed where she'd see it upon waking. When her eyes finally opened on that 6th morning, they were the color of creek water in summer, clear gray-green that seemed to hold light even in the dim cabin. She blinked slowly, taking in the rough log walls, the crackling fire, and finally the tall man, sitting in a chair beside the bed with a coffee cup balanced on his knee. Ethan spoke first, his voice rough from days of little use. He told her she'd been sick, that she was safe now, and asked if she remembered anything. Her response came in a whisper barely louder than breath. Her name was Lily Monroe. She was 16, and she'd been running from something she couldn't quite put into words. She'd gotten lost in the storm while trying to reach her aunt's homestead near Silver Creek, though she couldn't remember exactly where that was supposed to be. Winter released its grip slowly over the following weeks, as if reluctant to surrender the territory it had claimed. Snow melted into mud, revealing brown grass that would eventually remember how to be green. Through it all, Lily grew stronger, her body remembering youth and resilience. She insisted on making herself useful despite Ethan's protests, cooking simple meals that filled the cabin with warmth and good smells it hadn't known in years. The cabin transformed under her presence. She scrubbed years of bachelor grime from corners Ethan had forgotten existed. Wildflowers appeared in a jar on the table, simple prairie blooms that somehow made the rough space feel more like home than it had since his mother passed. She hummed while she worked, melodies her mother had taught her that spoke of green valleys and gentler places than the harsh frontier. Ethan found himself watching her more than he should, noticing how lamplight caught the gold in her brown hair, how her smile came easier each day, how she moved through a space as if she'd always belonged there. But he kept a careful distance, aware of the 12 years between them and the vulnerability of her situation. She was 16, still healing and dependent on his protection. Whatever he felt, and he felt plenty, had to remain unspoken. Spring brought visitors in early April. The circuit preacher arrived, a kindly man named Reverend Walsh who traveled between remote homesteads bringing news and offering spiritual guidance. Over supper, he mentioned the girls' school in Denver, a charitable institution where young women could receive education, learn proper trades, and build respectable futures. The school sought students, he explained, particularly bright girls who might otherwise lack opportunity. Ethan felt Lily's gaze across the table, but couldn't meet her eyes. The Reverend meant well, offering what he saw as salvation for a young woman in precarious circumstances. Society viewed unmarried girls living alone with men as a scandal, regardless of innocence or circumstance. The school represented propriety, education, and possibilities Ethan couldn't provide in his isolated valley. That night, after Reverend Walsh had retired to the barn, Lily and Ethan sat on the porch watching stars emerge. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, carrying promises of summer warmth still weeks away. Neither mentioned the school, but it hung between them like smoke, visible, unavoidable, already changing everything. Lily spoke first about Denver, about the school, and the future waiting there. She was practical enough to recognize opportunity when presented. Education meant she could support herself properly, become a teacher perhaps, build a life that didn't depend on charity. She owed Ethan everything, her life, her health, her dignity. But she couldn't stay here forever, imposing on his hospitality and potentially damaging his reputation. Ethan listened to her logical reasoning, hating every word because they were true. He couldn't offer her marriage. She was 16 to his 28, and the canyon between those numbers held implications he refused to cross. But somewhere between finding her half dead in the snow and watching her bring his home back to life, she'd become essential. Reverend Walsh agreed to escort Lily to Denver when he completed his circuit in 3 weeks. The morning she left arrived with painful clarity. Before she could climb into the wagon, Ethan reached up and removed his hat, the worn brown Stetson he'd owned for 10 years, its brim shaped by weather and work. He placed it on Lily's head, adjusting it gently despite it being too large. He told her the hat needed returning someday, that she should come back when she was ready and give it to him herself. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, an unspoken promise wrapped in practical instruction. Lily's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She nodded once, fierce and certain, then climbed into the wagon before either could say the true goodbye their hearts demanded. Chapter 3. The Years Between. Denver swallowed Lily whole that first month. The Mercy House School for Girls sat in a respectable neighborhood where tree-lined streets hummed with commerce and civilization. She shared a dormitory room with 5 other girls, all refugees from frontier hardship or family tragedy. They wore matching gray dresses, attended classes 6 days weekly, and learned deportment, mathematics, literature, and practical skills meant to transform frontier daughters into proper young women. Lily proved to be an excellent student. Her teachers praised her quick mind and steady application, noting how she absorbed lessons with focused intensity. She learned French from a stern Mademoiselle Beaumont, bookkeeping from Professor Hendricks, who smelled of pipe tobacco and chalk, and literature from Miss Caroline Webster, who introduced her to Keats and Shelley and poets who wrote of love with aching beauty that made her chest hurt. But at night, alone in her narrow bed while other girls slept, Lily would open her trunk and run her fingers over worn brown felt. Ethan's hat rested beneath her spare dresses, wrapped carefully in muslin to protect it from dust and damage. She'd lift it out, place it on her head, and remember the weight of his hands adjusting it that last morning, the way his eyes had held hers with desperate restraint and unspoken promises. She wrote him letters, dozens of them, describing her studies, the bustling city, and the life she was building. She wrote of her loneliness among crowds, her certainty that education was valuable but insufficient, and her growing understanding that the heart doesn't consult logic when choosing where it belongs. But she never sent the letters, keeping them instead in a bundle tied with ribbon, understanding that words on paper couldn't convey what needed saying face to face. 2 years passed in disciplined routine before Lily completed her studies. She was 18 now, certified to teach and equipped with skills meant to ensure respectable employment. When the school's placement office mentioned a teaching position in a small Wyoming town called Riverside, Lily's heart jumped before her mind could catch up. 60 miles from Silver Creek. Close enough to matter, far enough to maintain propriety. She accepted the position immediately, telling herself proximity meant nothing, that she'd chosen Riverside for the opportunity rather than the geography. But she kept Ethan's hat in her room at the boarding house above the Mercantile, and sometimes at night she'd stand at her window, looking west toward mountains that hid the valley where his ranch lay, wondering if he ever thought of her the way she thought of him. Constantly, helplessly, with the kind of longing that doesn't fade but instead grows roots. Meanwhile, Ethan worked his land with the grim determination of a man trying to outrun memory. He expanded his herd from 30 head to nearly 200, built a new barn with his own hands, and established himself as one of the territory's more successful independent ranchers. The work consumed his days, leaving him exhausted enough to sleep without dreaming. Most nights, anyway. Neighbors invited him to dinners where eligible women smiled hopefully across tables laden with good food and better intentions. There was Margaret Peterson, the banker's widow, with a pleasant laugh and steady temperament. Sarah Ann Thompson, barely 21 and pretty in that fresh-faced way that turned men's heads. Even stern Mrs. Caldwell tried matching him with her visiting niece from St. Louis, a refined woman who spoke of culture and civilization with the certainty of someone who'd never faced a Wyoming winter. Ethan remained polite but distant, declining invitations with excuses that grew thinner as months became years. The town matchmakers eventually gave up, declaring him a confirmed bachelor who'd married his ranch and needed no other companion. They weren't entirely wrong. Ethan found satisfaction in work, in watching his modest operation grow profitable, in the respect his neighbors showed when they sought his advice on cattle or crops. But satisfaction isn't the same as contentment. Contentment lived 5 years in the past, carried away in a wagon driven by a well-meaning preacher. It wore a faded blue dress and gray-green eyes, hummed melodies that made his rough cabin feel like home, and looked at him like he was something more than just another rough frontiersman trying to carve life from unforgiving land. He heard about her teaching position through the casual network of frontier gossip. A merchant mentioned it while Ethan bought supplies in town, commenting idly about the new schoolteacher in Riverside who trained at some fancy Denver institution. Something in the description, young, brown-haired, with an Eastern education but Western sensibility, made Ethan's hand still on the counter. He asked no questions, but listened carefully to every detail the merchant shared. 60 miles. Close enough to reach in a hard day's ride. Too far to casually encounter. Ethan told himself it didn't matter. That 5 years had passed, and she'd likely forgotten the rough rancher who'd pulled her from a snowstorm. She was educated now, refined, exactly the kind of respectable woman who deserved better than a man whose primary skills involved cattle and solitude. But knowing she was near, breathing the same territory air, sleeping under the same star-filled sky, changed something fundamental in the quality of his loneliness. It transformed from the dull ache of loss into something sharper, more immediate. Hope, maybe, though he tried not to name it, or the possibility, however distant, that the story which began in a blizzard might not yet be finished. In Riverside, Lily taught 15 students ranging from 6 to 14, farm children with calloused hands and eager minds. She loved the work, discovering satisfaction in watching comprehension dawn on young faces when difficult concepts finally made sense. But independence came with unexpected emptiness. Pleasant men asked to escort her home from church socials. She smiled politely and declined, unable to explain why none of them measured up to a memory of strong hands and quiet strength, of a man who'd sat vigil through her fever without expecting anything except that she survive. 5 years after leaving Silver Creek, Lily stood in her small room holding Ethan's hat and making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She was 22 now, old enough to know her mind, brave enough to claim what she wanted, and done waiting for perfect circumstances that would never arrive. Chapter 4. The Return. Summer mornings in Wyoming Territory carried a particular quality of light, golden and clear, turning ordinary landscape into something approaching sacred. Ethan had been mending the fence on the eastern boundary of his property when movement on the ridge caught his attention. A rider approached, moving with the confident ease of someone who'd spent time in the saddle. Even at a distance, something about the rider's silhouette struck Ethan as familiar. The way they sat the horse, the tilt of their head, and his heart stopped. The distinctive shape of a brown Stetson that he'd recognize anywhere because it had lived on his head for a decade before he'd placed it on someone else's. Ethan dropped his tools, unable to breathe properly, afraid to believe what his eyes insisted was true. The rider descended the slope steadily, and with each passing moment, certainty replaced disbelief. It was her, Lily, wearing his hat and riding toward him like something out of dreams he'd never admit to having. She pulled her horse to a stop 10 feet away, and for a long moment neither moved. 5 years had changed her in ways both obvious and subtle. She'd grown into her features, losing the last softness of girlhood and gaining elegant bones that had been waiting beneath. But she was still fundamentally herself, the girl who'd brought flowers into his rough cabin, who'd looked at him with gratitude that had slowly transformed into something neither had been ready to name. Lily dismounted with practiced grace, keeping one hand on the hat to prevent it falling. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quality he remembered, clear and steady with humor lurking at its edges. She said she'd come to return his hat, as promised. She'd kept it safe for 5 years, though she admitted she'd worn it sometimes when she missed him. Ethan took a step forward, then another, closing the distance, but still not quite touching. He told her the hat looked better on her than it ever had on him, which was probably why he'd given it to her in the first place. But his eyes, when he said it, held nothing casual. They blazed with 5 years of longing. Lily removed the hat slowly, holding it between them like an offering. She said she'd done everything right, gotten educated, found respectable work, built the independent life everyone said she needed. But none of it mattered because her heart had stayed here, in this valley, with a man who'd save her life and then set her free to discover she didn't want freedom if it meant living without him. Ethan took the hat with one hand and used the other to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. When he kissed her, It held 5 years of restraint finally released, desperate and tender and absolutely certain. Lily's arms came around his neck, the hat falling forgotten to the ground as she pressed closer. She'd already resigned her teaching position, she told him breathlessly, and burned every bridge that might tempt her towards second thoughts. She wasn't visiting, she was coming home. If he'd have her. Ethan's laugh rumbled from deep in his chest. He picked up the fallen hat and placed it back on her head where it belonged. He'd have her for every day she was willing to stay, which he hoped meant forever because he'd already wasted 5 years and wasn't interested in wasting another minute. Sometimes the bravest journey isn't the one that takes you away. It's the one that brings you back home. What began with mercy in a blizzard became a love worth waiting 5 years to claim. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which moment moved you most. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.